Hello and welcome to the fourth presentation in ELFA's Educational Gateway Series, The Impact of eLeasing on Funders. Please welcome our panelists. Today we have Brian Schoenfeld, Manager of Information Systems and Analytics at Pawnee Leasing, and Mr. John Jacobs, Director of FinTech Strategy at eOriginal. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. Today we'll be covering expert information from Brian and John that will provide insights into the benefits of eLeasing to funders versus a traditional lending process and resolve any lingering concerns over acceptance. In addition, they will take a deep dive into Pawnee Leasing's digital transformation and the benefits they have experienced as a result. John, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Allison. So in 2017, the Equipment Leasing and Finance Association had performed a survey of equipment finance activity. What was found in this survey was that 31% of the respondents had reported using electronic documents in at least a portion of their transactions in the year of 2016. So it's roughly about 10% increase over the previous year. So the trend is pretty evident. This is something that we've been talking about for some time. The world is going digital in many different ways, and this survey was a key indicator to show that the equipment leasing and finance industry, although sometimes a little slower than others, is still moving in the same direction. And I actually think that's really great growth. We'll talk a lot about the drivers of this, right? This is as much about the industry embracing and moving towards more of a digital business platform and environment, but it's also about the customer experience and expectations, increased competition, a lot of the key points that we'll hit as we go through this presentation and others. Speaking of that, this is something that the ELFA had kicked off some time ago and taken the position to educate the industry on how to begin to take that next step into a digital environment and what all the key considerations of that are. So as Allison mentioned, I think this is the fourth in a series of various webinars, but there's also an abundance of material that has also been created on the topic. So little by little, we're really building all the resources and really great resources to assist industry constituents in embracing and moving forward in the digital process. Here today, I'll talk a little bit about some of those key considerations, but more importantly, from a very practical perspective, Brian, my cohort here, is going to talk about the practical perspective from his side and assist in Pawnee in that digital transformation. So I'll begin with a good question. What is e-leasing? What does that mean? So as I go about the industry and I speak with players from affiliates to funders to funding sources to custodians and secondary market players, everybody's got a little bit different perspective. We'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes and kind of the roles that everybody plays, but naturally there's, the definition changes or modifies from party to party. When we talk about e-leasing, it's not about just capturing an electronic signature and affixing it to a document, although that's a very relevant piece of the puzzle. That's usually step one. When we think about taking the process digital, it's how can we create a better, more efficient, more friendly lessee or customer experience, and that includes interacting with your deals and your documents digitally. So a natural phase in that is the idea of capturing electronic signature. E-leasing in itself is much more than that. It's really not just about e-signature, it's about the process. A few of the requirements that we'll talk about here in a bit around the idea of having electronic chattel versus paper chattel are not very static issues. for instance, the concept of having what we in Article 9-105 of the UCC call an authoritative copy, it's not one thing. It really revolves around how an electronic chattel authoritative copy deal is created and how it's managed throughout its life cycle. And it has much more to do than the signature. So, for instance, there are reasonable assumptions that we make in the paper world over the course of hundreds and thousands of years of dealing with paper contracts that you really can't make in the electronic world. One of those assumptions is if I receive a wet signed document and it does not look like any information within that document has been scribbled out, erased, crossed over, or white out, or anything like that, then I can reasonably assume that the information within that paper document has not been changed. Those assumptions can't be made in the digital world. As we all know, it's very easy to search and replace digital information. So one of the key elements is ensuring the integrity of the deal, providing evidence to show that the information within that deal had not been changed, at least not unauthorized, since the deal was executed. So that's just an example of one of the assumptions that we might make in the paper world that does not roll over into the digital. And that's all about process. How is the process deployed to support the ability in ensuring that information within the deal itself has not been changed? And then we talk about one of the key pillars of those folks who will leverage this chattel paper, or in our world, electronic chattel paper, for capital needs. How can you ensure that you have one unique original, just like you would have in the paper world? Again, that was a reasonable assumption that we made. If you've received a piece of paper you can look at it and reasonably assume that you have possession of an original document. Again, you can't, that assumption doesn't roll over into the digital world, and this is where the concept of authoritative copy comes from. It's ensuring that you have one unique and identifiable electronic, just like you would have had in the paper world. So this is not one thing. It's how the entire process works for you. So it's not about just e-signature. It's not about presenting an electronic document. It's all those different elements. We'll try to hit on many of those elements as we go through this, at least the most critical ones as we go through. So there are several different ways of funding the business, and there are several different models within the ELFA industry that exist, whether it be working through affiliates, direct funding, capital markets and warehousing. So there are a lot of different ways in bringing capital into the business, and with that, a lot of different processes in which chattel paper deals are executed within the ELFA industry. So when an originator, whether it be an affiliate on behalf of other parties or somebody who is originating chattel paper directly, when they make this change, it's not just affecting the way that they do business. It's going to affect the way that all of those other parties in the capital and secondary markets, or generally just the post-closing side of the business. It's going to affect the way that all of those parties interact with those deals moving forward. So in all cases, what we find, there's not one decision maker in the process. You really have to involve all of the parties that would be involved or that would have some level of interest in the deals that are being executed through the process. So this is in often cases everybody from your funding source who would have an interest in the deals and in the value that those deals represent, all the way through ratings agencies for those participants that take the path of securitizing pools of their assets. It really, in most cases, taking the process digital almost never affects just one party. So this is an example from the point of origination all the way through those secondary market players all the way to the inside and outside counsels that really should be included within the process. And Brian can kind of talk about his experience as well in how he needed to include multiple parties as he was working on this project internally. So I'd open it up to Brian to chime in anywhere that he feels comfortable in his experience with some of these other parties.
Yeah, certainly, we wanted to touch base with our outside counsel, making sure that we were all on the same page as it relates to protecting our interest. And then, we do have a bank syndicate that funds us, and we wanted to ensure that they were okay with the procedure, access to our vaulted original, they had access to that, and watermarks and stuff. So it was a little bit of a new issue for them a couple years ago, but it wasn't anything of a showstopper. And for the most part, I think it was just explaining to them what we had and how things were changing, and really ensuring that they were comfortable that they still had that priority security interest in the collateral, which is our loans and leases that we use to back that funding.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I always suggest you want to have discussions with those participants leading up to it. We always think about how do we implement these projects. How do you take a document, turn it digital, and start electronic signing? But there's certainly a lot of work leading up to that. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, that ELFA has began this campaign with helping to educate the industry and bringing in the industry experts. But I highly suggest when you embark in that process, even before you get to the point of talking about APIs and adding electronic signatures or moving the documents to digital, let's involve all these parties and have the right discussions. That way you can remove some of those hurdles.
Definitely. Sorry to cut you off there, Don. Yeah, definitely. I would echo that highly. Things always take longer than you think, and it's not just how busy you are, but how busy your other parties are. And so, the sooner you can kind of start to broach some of these subjects, the better.
And as we all know, the legal discussions never move quickly.
Yes.
So key differences, if I could list them all out now, it may take the remainder of our time, but I'll just focus on some of the more important differences. It's pretty much everything from the way that we authenticate lessees to the way that we present documents to the lessees, all the way through the process of moving deals out into the market, whether we're selling them or leveraging them for the purposes of whatever capital needs we might have. So the differences in the process can be pretty dramatic, and when we talk about kind of the efficiencies that come from that, we'll hit on some of those subjects here in a few minutes, but the entire experience is going to change. And we often talk about the lessee's experience, right? How do our lessees, how do our customers interact with us, moving from a paper-based process to a digital process? But truth is, it's going to transform the entire business. The differences that occur in-house are going to be just as dramatic as the experience that your customers go through. For instance, a document manager or documentation manager, whoever it is, typically within your house that's managing the workflow, how documents come into the business, how they get routed, their lives are going to become far more efficient. So this is not just about how you leverage technology to capture an electronic signature. It's also how you leverage that technology to route those documents internally and externally, removing the fax and printing, all those wonderful things that we often talk about, also removing the shipping fees associated with moving those documents to custodians or any of the other players that might have interest post-closing. So those are some of the key things that even Brian can talk to as we go through this. You'll always find we become focused on how do we change particular pieces of the experience, and you end up finding that the process changes a lot more of your business than what you might realize. How you interact with your current systems today to how you manage the data that flows through your system. So it's certainly more than just the concept of capturing an electronic signature and managing a piece of electronic chattel. Now, if we talk about just really some of the attributes, these are things I know Brian will hit on as kind of we continue this discussion here, but this question of identity really has existed since the beginning times of the internet, and it still exists today. Who is the person on the other line that I'm speaking to? We've done a really good job at creating multiple sources and means of trying to authenticate lessees and users over the internet. So really creating reasonable assurance that they are who they say they are. In the ELFA industry, I've seen really to a large extent high adoption of typically what we would term out-of-wallet questioning or out-of-wallet authentication. This typically means that your lessee or your customer is going through a series of questions that they have to answer. It's pulled from public databases and credit reporting agencies, and they usually have to answer a certain number of these questions correctly in order to move forward in the experience, and that information being captured within an audit trail serves as evidence to prove that you've created reasonable assurance of their identity. We often today talk about multi-factor authentication. I think everybody likes the idea of capturing information from different perspectives that all serve to help create the person's digital identity and validate the person's digital identity. So you could put them through a Q&A exam and send them passcodes via SMS text message. So not only are you collecting their cell phone number, you're also having them answer a series of questions that most other people would not be able to answer on their behalf. So there's not, in equipment finance, I hear this all the time. What is the industry telling us we have to do? What are our bankers telling us we have to do? What do the regulators tell us we have to do? Well, there's no cut and dry answer to that. The regulators aren't saying this is how you have to authenticate lessees, and funding sources across the board aren't saying this is exactly what you need to do. It's just a matter of creating reasonable assurance, and some of these methods that you see mentioned up here by way of authentication help to do that. I always suggest seeking the guidance of an expert in the space, right? This could be vendors that provide the services. They're subject matter experts. It can be your in-house counsel, but make sure there's comfortability internally as you're talking about how are we going to use technology to authenticate our lessees or our customers remotely. I'm always on the side of multi-factor processes. So going beyond how do we authenticate, and Brian, please feel free to stop me and chime in at any point on your experiences, because I know you've gone through the processes of authentication.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll probably cover some of these during Pawnee's implementation, but just one thing on authentication is I think it's important to keep in mind that, we're not going to achieve, nor should we be looking for a completely 100% foolproof process on authentication, right? But in Pawnee's instance, the authentication is certainly more secure than our paper documents, which is just comparing, for the majority of transactions, comparing the signatures on a driver's license and doing a verbal verification, asking for the last four of their social and birth date and stuff. So it's certainly a much higher barrier to fraudulent entry using this versus the old system we have. But again, nothing is perfect, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind you're never going to find a foolproof system, digital or otherwise.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Brian. That's the reason why we bring it up, right? These are things that you want to talk about. It's another thing when you think about taking the process electronic. Sometimes we become channel focused. How do we present the document to our lessee? And sometimes we might not fully think about what are the systems or the procedures that we're going to use to authenticate the lessee. So it's really just a matter of getting folks talking about it. So once you've authenticated a lessee, what's the next step? It's presenting, and it's giving them the ability to apply their electronic signature. This is really performed in several different ways, right? It can be face-to-face. When we think about electronic signing, we so often just kind of think about how you leverage electronic signatures to remotely sign documents. But it can also be used face-to-face, right? It really enables the ability to remove paper from the process, whether it's signing on a signing pad if you're at a brick-and-mortar office, or leveraging an email invitation that'll take you to a secure web portal where you can affix your electronic signature to a document regardless of wherever you might be. Generally today I see, because of the prevalence of smart devices, right? Your iPhone, the phones and tablets. We're using finger signatures, right? A lot of people are drawing their signature using their finger on these devices. But even still today, a lot of text, what we call text type signatures, where the lessees or the signers are typing their name into a keypad. That's just in high of use today. So there's not the definition, the legal definition of electronic signature was made to be pretty broad. There are a lot of different ways that you can present that document to the lessee and enable them to electronically sign it. So when you talk about the benefits, I think a lot of the participants on this webinar are here because you realize that there are some benefits. I mentioned earlier, the competitive landscape is changing, right? Everybody is beginning to enable digital processes in some form or fashion. So generally, if your competitors are doing it, you have to begin to look at it. But also there are real tangible benefits. Put competition aside. Getting money faster, right? This is, from our perspective, this is something that we see all the time, whether you're a funding source that's drawing down from a warehouse or a line of credit, the speed of which you can move these deals out to your different funding sources is by far dramatically different than what it was in the paper world. So you can enable your business to receive funding a lot quicker. On the front end of that, for those originators, for those who are funding through affiliates and all these other wonderful front-end processes, the process itself is much more efficient, more quicker, less errors, right? This is, we often talk about, again, streamlining the processes and moving to a digital environment. One of the key benefits in that is the removal of errors and omissions. Years back when I started working in the equipment leasing and finance space, and I started talking about how to transform these processes digitally, I think what I found was, upwards of 30% of the paper documents came back to the office with something missing signatures, inaccurate data, and that costs a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time to make that right. When you remove, or when you remove paper from the process and you move to eLeasing, you really reduce the chances of having errors and omissions. And you see this as you go through these processes today. Everybody's filled out information online. You see how the information is required. So it's much easier to capture accurate and full information when you take the process digital. With that, you remove those errors and omissions. That alone has a lot of great benefits to it. So with respect to funding sources, I'd hand this over to Brian, and kind of feel free to say my name if you ever want me to jump in. I'm not short on words, buddy.
No problem at all. Thanks, John. Appreciate it. So, there are various funding sources, and they obtain their transactions through different sources, different sorts, right? So, a lot of work through dealer networks, and these dealers work with multiple finance companies who are usually independent lessors, right, and they work off of other people's money. They leverage deals or collateralize. If they're not independent, then usually they're either a bank subsidiary, they're owned by a bank, or they're an arm of a bank, or they could be captives. So, for example, I know GE has obviously a large captive. Chrysler Financial used to be around as a captive for Chrysler Automobiles, and John Deere Financial finances John Deere. So, those of you who know they're kind of tough to go up against, right? Because a lot of their margin is in the sale of the equipment, so they can be quite shallow on rates. But Pawnee, we're an example of a non-bank funding source. So just a brief background, we've been around 35 years. We originate all of our transactions solely through what we term the broker or the third-party channel. So we don't have any internal salespeople. All of our transactions are brought by those brokers, and we do a wide range of credit appetites, anything from really a C or a D credit up to an A credit. And transactions up to around 200,000. Financial Pacific, another market industry leader in our space, they are a subsidiary of a bank. They're a subsidiary of Umpqua Bank. But they, again, bring their documents and bring their transactions very similar to how we do, right? Mostly through third-party channel. I think, John, I'm going to pass it back to you for the influences of funders and stuff, possession versus control, and then I'll have a lot of stuff to speak about.
Well, you know how much I love to talk about possession versus control.
Exciting stuff.
So, often when I spoke earlier that eLeasing is more than just capturing an electronic signature, and I spoke briefly on this concept of an authoritative copy, and I usually consider this to be kind of the second pillar of going digital. The first pillar is, the electronic signature process, right? Somehow it's a progression. But authoritative copy is very critical because I spoke about the concept of an authoritative copy and how we can't make these assumptions that we once made in the paper world that what we have received is in itself the same deal that our lessee had signed, right? All these variables change. Well, this third pillar, right? What happens when you can ensure that you do have something that is considered legally an authoritative copy, something that is unique and identifiable and distinguishable from all the copies that might have been made? Well, the third pillar is how do you possess it? So in the digital world, we often use the word control as a replacement for paper's possession. So said simply, if I were to possess an original wet-signed chattel paper, I'd also want to control and electronically sign eChattel paper or authoritative copy. The way that this is accomplished is first making sure that you have an authoritative copy, but second, having a system that can accurately identify that you have control over that one unique electronic authoritative copy. The way that we do this today is by leveraging what we call electronic vaults or electronic counts that can hold these electronic chattel papers, and the accounts are under specific legal entities. So, for instance, if you have a funding source, an originator who has a line of credit with another funding source or might assign their deals to another funding source, we could create an electronic vault where the control of that authoritative copy exists under the legal name of the party who's originating it, and another electronic vault under the legal name of maybe the special purpose vehicle or the entity that's being created to kind of manage the interest of the creditors or the funding sources. And we can leverage the vaults to distinguish the difference between the legal entities that have interest in those electronic documents. So, for instance, if I were to leverage my electronic chattel paper to receive funding from another source, and in the paper world, that funding source of mine had specific rules that they had to play by, for instance, to perfect their interest in that collateral, they would need to take possession of it. So in the paper world, what they would do is file a UCC-1, they'd march into my offices, they'd take possession of all the paper that I have that might be deemed, their collateral under our security agreement. They'd walk out of my office and try and find somebody else to buy it. To perform that process digitally, it's really a matter of taking control. So for the funding sources and the capital providers on that end of the market, there's a lot of benefits as well. This process of perfecting interest in deals by taking control as opposed to having to rely on possessing physical pieces of paper is much easier and can be accomplished much quicker. So just kind of following that pattern, these are a lot of the things that funding sources look for, right? We spoke about authoritative copy. That's number one. If you capture an electronic signature, you want to be able to prove that to your other market constituents, whether it be your custodian, your funding source, your attorneys, you want to be able to prove that you do have a unique authoritative copy compliant with Article 9 of the UCC. You also want to be able to show that you have a reliable means of enabling them to take control of that authoritative copy. So this is back to there not being one static thing to do. It's a process. How do you create one unique original authoritative copy, manage it within a system that multiple parties could have some sort of access to? These are the things that funding sources will look for post-execution in the process. Now, I know I worked closely with Brian years back when he had taken on this digital initiative, and I know there were just a couple of hurdles and objections that he faced along the way. So I'll turn it back over to Brian and let him walk you through that.
Great, John. I appreciate it. So, as I mentioned earlier, Pawnee Leasing gets all of our business 100% through third-party originators, their broker channel. So, no matter how great of a product we had internally, if we couldn't get our broker network, in effect our salespeople, to buy into it, it was a wasted effort. So, when we started the process, we kind of spoke with some customers and some of our brokers and what were your thoughts about this? And certainly there were some concerns we tried to address. One of them, obviously the big one, was it's too complicated, right? They didn't want to have to log into a different system and put information in and do all this crazy stuff. We have an internal documentation generation system here, which automatically populates and creates those documents and really does everything for our customer, for our broker customer. And they were afraid that they'd have to duplicate those efforts or, a lot of extra steps. And so one of the things we really wanted to focus on was ensuring ease of use, right? They click one button to create a PDF. They create another button, boom, to send it out electronically. So that took a little while to get under control, but certainly was a priority for us. Speaking of control, since the documents are being generated through our system, a lot of our brokers like those documents to be sent to them. They could then review them, ensure them for accuracy, and then forward them on to their customers. And them being sent electronically, they weren't able to see them. So it was kind of two things to really get them comfortable. One was, you can generate a PDF of that document before it goes out. But really, I think the biggest thing was just, they've been working with Pawnee for a while. We're very accurate. Customer service is our priority. And we were focused on making sure that a product that went out was up to our standards. So it was just a comfort level of them realizing, this is going to be accurate. It's not going to be any different. If I feel comfortable with it in the system, it's going to be fine. And then the final issue that some had concerns of, and this was also kind of an objection internally, was this verification process. And as we spoke about earlier, realizing and really understanding it's not a perfect system by any means. Nothing is perfect, right? That being said, we here at Pawnee use an access code, which is kind of a first layer. So it's a 4-digit code that the broker provides to that customer and says this is what you need. And then they go through those out-of-wallet ID check authentications. And so it's the term out-of-wallet is that the theory behind it is if someone stole your wallet with your driver's license or credit card numbers or address, they still wouldn't be able to pass this check because it's asking questions of what kind of car do you finance and where did you live 10 years ago, what city, and who is Steve Schoenfeld in relation to you and what's his age. So get him to understand that, yeah, it's not perfect, but, it's certainly going to be a high level of authentication as opposed to just looking at a driver's license and getting a signature. There have been discussions. We could certainly have a higher level of verification, authentication, right? Two-factor authentication, other means. But again, it goes back to that collections versus sales, right? Sales wants to have it nice and easy and open and real easy for those customers to sign those documents, and then collections here wants to have it super tied down and get notarized bank signatures on everything. So it's a balance. We feel very comfortable with that. Moving on to our transformation, why did we make that transition to eLeasing? Really, it was to help differentiate ourselves from the competitors as we entered a new market. Historically, Pawnee Leasing has been a small ticket startup and challenge credit, and as we move into more of a mainstream B&A world, we want to have something to help us differentiate ourselves and really bring attention to us. I think everyone understands that it's the future. Where that future is and how long is unknown, but we wanted to be an industry leader and lead that transformation. And so, the requirements were, again, that it was easy for us, it was easy for our customers, and that the brokers were amenable to it. Solution, again, worked with DocuSign, worked with eOriginal to set up a process that it was all automatic for those third-party customers and for the end user, the borrower, the lessee. Very simple. Those of you who know eDocs, you click and move along and can do easy processes, and it's not a problem at all. As we'll discuss in the next couple of slides, the results have been fantastic. Really been a high adoption rate and have been really well taken. If we could go to the next slide. So, what are some of the processes behind this? We discussed, obviously, John, in great detail, discussed the identification and verification of intent and the audit trail. But really wanted to make sure that we created those documents and those packages in our internal system and created that API, that interface between the system and between our internal system and DocuSign. So, it was a little bit of a challenge getting it smooth, getting it easy for our customers. Again, it all goes back to we wanted it to be an easy process, a similar process for our broker customers and for our end users. Otherwise, no one would use it, right? So it took a little while to get that challenge up and running, but really the benefits have been tremendous. One, increased speed. Obviously, we're no longer overnighting items. They're being sent out. Customers can sign wherever they are, as opposed to the old days when even if it's an email sent with a PDF, they still need to print it out and sign it and fax it back, so I have to be in the office. Transportation or people on job sites, they're able to receive those documents, view them, and sign them even on their phone. So it really speeds that process up. We're no longer waiting for the customer to sign documents. Increased accuracy. As John mentioned, really a lot of problems is documents coming back incomplete. It comes back and a signature was forgotten or they didn't fill in this field. As you may know, through the DocuSign process, they cannot complete that document. They can't, quote unquote, sign that document until all fields have been completed. So it really has been a boon for our funding team, not having to go back and waste time. And really our broker customers appreciate it as well. They want to get the deal done. 9 times out of 10, they're not there with the customer. So, they're helpless as well. So they really liked it. As well, really keeping the brokers updated as to the status of those documents. The system is great in that we have a link between the DocuSign system, our eDoc system, and our broker interface in that they can log in and check and see exactly where those documents are. Joe Bob opened the documents, but he hasn't signed them. Joe Bob has opened them and signed them, and now Mary Sue has signed them, and they're back to us. So really, as opposed to where those documents and calling and potentially bothering the customer, they know exactly where they are. One of the things that was brought up earlier is kind of the secondary market. We currently have a bank syndicate that funds us, and they take a security interest in those documents. One of the nice things is that we do have the ability to do what's called papering out. which in essence removes that document from that vault and creates an authenticative individual paper copy. But our banks have been great in that, nobody's required to do that. We haven't had to do that for any legal purposes or anything like that. We currently hold and service all of our transactions, but we've made some exploratory calls and thoughts about, do we get into securitization and selling off some tranches of documents? And, the initial discovery phase is that this is not going to be an issue at all. If we can move, kind of the process flow. We already kind of went over this briefly, but really, there's an email sent out to the end user. So we're going to say Joe Bob's Towing, and Joe Bob is the guarantor, the owner of that transaction. So Joe Bob is going to receive those documents, an email with those documents, and he's going to click on that link, and he's going to enter his security code, which is provided to him by our broker. And then he's going to go through the authentication process. Again, we have the ID check process. We don't do any social media verification or two-party factor authentication or anything like that, but those out-of-wallet questions we feel are fairly stringent, and fraud has definitely decreased since we have utilized these documents. And then before they can actually utilize the documents, they can go ahead and they need to consent to use an electronic contract. And if they decide not to do that, they can decline, in which case they'll go back to their broker and they'll send documents. They can actually, if they want, at that point in time, they can print a paper copy. They can say, no, I don't want to do this newfangled document process. I can send it out. So they're going to review that contract. They can always save it and go back if they have any questions. But again, we have fairly well locked in as far as the templates and what they're utilizing, so it kind of guides them. And what I mean by that is they can't just put ABC for a bank routing number. Is required that there has to be a certain number of digits, and there has to be digits in there. And then they go through, and as John mentioned, they're going to sign that document, and that might be using their finger to sign on the screen. It might be typing in that name, whatever. Those documents, once everybody has signed them, they are then sent back to Pawnee. They're still in this kind of DocuSign or other cloud. They're reviewed by our funding team exactly as any other set of documents would. We get a PDF, we look at it, we do our standard funding process in which, we go through and we look to make sure that everything's filled out properly, it matches up with the approval, we have an invoice. Once that is done and we fund the transaction, we then sign the documents, countersign the documents. And as soon as we countersign those documents, as soon as we complete the process here, they are immediately, securely, electronically dumped into that eOriginal vault, which is talking about the UCC9 and the chattel paper, which is so vital, as John was mentioning. And then everyone gets a copy. Joe Bob and Mary Sue all get a copy sent to their email as well. So it's a very secure and slick process. If you want to move on to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. Efficiency, customer experience, transparency. It really has been a great experience for us. Our brokers appreciate it. As I mentioned, speed for them. If an addendum needs to be created, if something needs to be changed, rather than printing it out and FedExing it or even faxing it and going to the fax machine, if an addendum needs to be completed, it literally can be completed in a matter of minutes. Our funding person will contact the broker and say, Mr. Broker, hey, we need to change this. We need to add this PG. Your payment is incorrect, actually. It should be $482, not $485. The broker is going to log into the system, automatically generate an addendum, click Send for e-signing. Boom, it goes to Joe Bob. Joe Bob signs it on his phone. Boom, comes right back to Pawnee. It could be literally minutes. So that speed has really been an increased benefit. Everybody likes it, as well as I mentioned, the accuracy, not having missing signatures, not having form fields filled out, and the transparency as well, as far as, again, that broker knows where those documents are. Once they hit our system, they always get updates as to we're reviewing it, here's what we're missing. But when the documents are out in the ether, right, when they're out being signed by the customer, he doesn't know, we don't know, they don't know what's going on. At this point in time, he can log in and see Joe Bob hasn't even opened it yet. Joe Bob's opened it, but he hasn't signed it yet. You know, he can look, if it's been 2 days that Joe Bob has opened it, he knows Joe Bob's looking at it. He can call Joe Bob and, hey, is there any questions, concerns, problems? So they really like that aspect of it. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, again, you know, we don't currently securitize any of our transactions. We don't sell off any tranches of business, but in the exploratory discussions that we've had, really no issues there. So, if you want to pop on the next slide, we've got kind of a quote from one of our brokers. Nate Bourne, Hampton Ridge Financial, he actually used to work for Manifest Funding Services back in the day. He's one of our top brokers, and really I think he says it very well. E-documents have increased our funding efficiencies by a very measurable amount. The speed in which we fund transactions has been a nice improvement to our customers, their equipment sellers, and us. It's also been very convenient to not have to overnight original documents back and forth from our clients. So if we can pop to the next slide. As I kind of mentioned, you know, securitization is on the front for us, but nothing yet. And I'm going to kind of stop talking here, John, and I know you're itching to get back into the fray here, so I'm kind of going to transition back to you for some securitization collateralization speech or discussion from an industry standpoint as a whole.
It's kind of funny. Allison was looking at me. She said this is the quietest she's seen me in quite some time, but you've done a great job, Brian. And also, I'm only going to add this, is I see Joe Bob all the time. He loves what you guys are doing, so you're right. He's really happy. You know, a lot of the pillars that I had mentioned earlier, right, this concept of authoritative copy and taking control of the authoritative copy, they're not static things, right? It's not flipping a switch and it happens. You need sophisticated systems to help manage you through these processes. So first off, it's about choosing your partners. You know, we tend to use the word vendor very often. There are a lot of vendors in this space, but in this case, it's more than just a vendor. You need somebody to partner with you on the process. We talked about the industry constituents earlier on, right? Funding sources and custodians and in-house counsel and out-house counsel. One thing that wasn't on my slide that Brian had brought up several times was the customer, right? How's the customer, the end signer? How are they interacting with the experience? You really need somebody that's going to partner with you through that process. And I don't want to say hold hand, but really be a part of it and integrate it in these discussions, because realistically, the barriers to e-leasing, they're not high hurdles to overcome. It really just, it involves conversation, right? Beginning with those parties early on, we talked about bringing in your funding sources and your attorneys and your custodians if you're working with them, bringing them on early into the discussions and working with your partners to educate them on the process. A lot of these great things that happen up front that they're going to look for, right? They want to see that you've reasonably authenticated your lessees, right? So you have to use some sort of process to reasonably authenticate, whether it be single factor or multi-factor. You have to be able to show that copies haven't escaped the system that could be deemed original at some point, right? You have to have one single unique authoritative copy. You have to have a system deployed so that they can take control of this authoritative copy. And this is not just funding source, right? Go back to the custodian matter. If you were to securitize, you know, or go down the path of an ABS type of transaction, other parties, servicers and custodians and indentures need to touch and have access to this collateral. So it's really building out the process in a manner that makes all of those parties comfortable. It's been done. It's been done. This is, you know, there have been hundreds and hundreds of millions to billions of dollars of assets and electronic chattel assets that have been securitized in the secondary market. There are hundreds of millions to trillions of dollars of assets that are being originated electronically. So the market acceptance is there. You just got to involve the right parties. So that's kind of the biggest thing I'd say take away from this is involve all your partners in the beginning. Make sure you have a good cadence with those partners and service providers that you're using. Pull in those parties. If you plan to securitize, if you're like Brian and you have a syndicate, involve your bankers. Involve them early. Make sure they know what you're doing. Make sure you're educating them on the process, and things will go pretty smoothly. I know we only have a few minutes here, about 6 minutes left, and I'm going to hand it over to Allison. I think we have some questions that have come through.
First, I just want to thank you, Brian and John, for some great content and insight. How can non-vault clients deposit documents into our vault?
How can non-vault clients deposit documents into our vault? Boy, you could have given me an easier question, right? So there are a lot of different scenarios that this could be addressing. First and foremost, when I think about if I have my own electronic vault and I'm doing business with somebody that does not have an electronic vault, my first question is, are we talking the same language? Even if they're doing something electronically, what I've often seen is we get so channel focused on creating a more friendly user experience or customer experience. So we think we're very channel focused on creating an electronic signature process that sometimes we don't fully recognize that there's a process post-execution that needs to be changed. So sometimes I see that there are parties who are electronically signing documents that might not necessarily be Article 9 compliant or what we would consider a compliant electronic chattel deal. With that said, there are very specific protocols that are generally accepted in the market that enable the ability to move electronic contracts or electronic authoritative copies securely from one physical environment to another physical environment. So it's kind of an open-ended question because there can be several ways in which we can address it. There are absolute ways to take authoritative copies from one electronic vault and put them into another, and even take paper chattel deals and put them into an electronic vault, essentially changing the medium and turning them into electronic chattel deals. So I would love to speak with the person that posed the question and kind of find out a little more detail.
We do get that question all the time from our third-party brokers is that, hey, I've got electronic signatures. I'd like to start using our process versus yours. And, you come to find out that they only have half the process. And as well, we do have some that have complete systems. They do have that vault. And transferring documents from one vault to another, we do with some of our partners. And it's very easy. It's very simple. So I'm not sure if that kind of answers the question at all, but I thought I'd just kind of post some 2 cents there.
Okay, great. So it looks like you just have time for one more. One came in around DocuSign and eOriginal. Brian, you mentioned DocuSign and eOriginal. How are you guys working together?
Yeah, so DocuSign is kind of the signature process for us. So as I mentioned, we have our system, internal in-house system, synced up through various APIs with DocuSign. So the documents themselves are sent through DocuSign. So when our customer logs into our system and says, click send for e-signing, what in essence they're doing is they're generating a call, an API call from our system to DocuSign with all that information that's populating the electronic documents. And those documents actually go out from DocuSign. So Joe Bob, our favorite tow truck operator there, actually is going to get an email from, I forget, something, blah, 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 at DocuSign on behalf of Nate Bourne at Hampton Ridge. Once those documents, and that document process of the signatures being collected and tracked and moved along are all controlled by DocuSign. Once we then sign those documents, we sign them in DocuSign, that file in DocuSign is closed down, and that file immediately, that original electronic chattel paper, gets punched over into the eOriginal vault. So eOriginal is where we store, and you can think of it as the warehouse where we store our originals. Back in the day, we had a very large storage facility with Iron Mountain out here, and we put paper copies in there, and those were our original chattel paper. It's the same thing now in electronic format.
Thanks, Brian. I'd only expand in saying that usually when I talk with when I speak with attorneys, and most folks become generally knowledgeable of some of the laws that you need to comply with. One of them being the e-sign law, which is the Electronic Signatures and Global and National Commerce Act. The other being UCC 9-105, which covers electronic chattel paper. And usually what I say is DocuSign and eOriginal have a partnership that spans well beyond a decade, where they're kind of the best-in-breed e-signature solution. eOriginal is the best-in-breed electronic asset management solution and electronic vault. So they would generally handle your compliance with e-sign law, and eOriginal would handle your compliance with UCC related law. So it's kind of a very natural partnership, and as Brian had mentioned, these kind of has the best of both worlds, where he uses them on the front end and eOriginal post-close.
Great. Well, that's going to have to wrap up our question and answer section of the event. We are going to close out, and as I said, we will be emailing out a copy of the presentation and our video today. And we also just would like to thank ELFA for helping us host our 4th series. And that will conclude our event today. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. And that concludes our event.